Well, good evening. This is Miss Degenford. We're going to be looking at the classification of plants first, and then we're going to look a little bit about each one. Plants are classified based upon their internal structure, whether or not they have vascular tissue, whether or not they produce seeds, whether or not they produce flowers. It's a pretty basic classification, and you should recognize these. This is a cladogram. We did these back in January and February. And what we start out with, we have a group called the bryophytes, and these are going to be our mosses. Now there are other groups as well, so I'm really only giving a selection of these types of plants, and this is a representative. And the mosses, the bryophytes, are non-vascular, and the vascular tissue is a set of tubes, the xylem and the phloem, and this helps them transport water and sugars. Now, bryophytes don't have that. Now, on the other side, we start seeing our characteristic, which is our vascular tissue. And the vascular tissue is going to be our xylem and phloem. And the plants that would first see this, we see that in ferns. And the ferns are vascular plants, but they are seedless. They do not produce seeds. They are going to reproduce by spores. So in our next grouping, we see the development of seeds. And of this group, we can divide it into gymnosperms. And gymnosperm is directly translated naked seed. And these are the cone-bearing plants. And the cone-bearing plants, like our pine cones, redwood, sequoias, those are the cone-bearing plants. They do not flower and they do not produce fruit. So these are seed plants, but they do not produce fruit. Well, over on the other side, we have fruit or flowering. And the fancy name for these would be angiosperms. And the angiosperms, these would be your flowering trees like oaks and maples and dogwoods and redbuds, and then all of your flowers that you're familiar with that you guys actually listed to me the first day. Now, the angiosperms can actually be divided into another subgroup, monocots, and they tend to have parallel venation. The daffodil that we dissected is a monocot, and then dicot, and they have the branched venation. Very common, like a rose bush or a maple tree. Those would be dicots. Now, if we scooch down for a second, we have mosses. They are, again, non-vascular, no xylem, no phloem. They end up having to be very small, and that's related to the fact that they are non-vascular. They don't really have a system for transporting water any great distances, and that really does limit where they live. They have very, very simple root-like structures called rhizoids, and these are single-celled little root-like anchoring systems that they can absorb water, and they're single-celled in a row. And then they have very, very simple leaves that aren't very differentiated. Again, seedless. They reproduce by spores, and they are what we call gametophyte dominant. Now, in order to understand what this means, we have to take a step back and take a look at just how strange plant reproduction is. Plants reproduce in a system called alternation of generations. An alternation of generations refers to the idea that plants, in a plant life cycle, we see an alternation of haploid and diploid stages. Now, if we were to make a very simple, basic life cycle, we might start out with something called a sporophyte. Now, a sporophyte you can kind of break down the word. Phyte is the fancy name for plant. So this is a spore-producing plant. And just as the name implies, a sporophyte is going to produce spores. And we need to establish something first. The sporophyte is diploid. It is 2N. Now, if you need to take a pause and review, diploid means that there's two sets of chromosomes, and then haploid would be one set of chromosome. If you recall, we would be diploid, 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs, 23 one set from mom, 23 another set from dad. And so the sporophyte is also diploid, and we call it 2N. So the sporophyte is going to have some cells that undergo meiosis. And meiosis, if you review in your mind, meiosis is this process that is going to produce haploid cells. And these are going to be called spores. And the spores are just going to be 1N haploid. Now, ordinarily, think about what might happen in an animal. In an animal, we have the diploid organism, whether or not male or female, and that male or female has cells that undergo meiosis as well, and they produce the gametes. Well, we don't see gametes yet. We see spores. Now, these spores are going to grow and become a gametophyte. Now this gametophyte, again, break down the word. Phyte is plant, gameto, gamete. So this is a part of the plant that produces gametes. So we've got this gametophyte, also haploid. We haven't seen anything change. We see it haploid, 1N. But the key here is this is multicellular. And that's just a weird thing to wrap your head around, because that means we've got these cells that are haploid that are just dividing and dividing and dividing. And that would be somewhat analogous. Think about like a multicellular egg cell in an animal life cycle. And that's just such a weird idea to kind of ponder. But here we have that in plants, a gametophyte that is multicellular. And we're almost on. This gametophyte is going to have certain cells that develop into the gametes. And now we're back into familiar territory. The gametes are going to be the egg and the sperm. And again, these are both haploid, 1N. That's not in, that's 1N. And then we're almost back to the cycle, but we need the egg fertilized. Now, just to show that this is not going to self-fertilize as much as we can prevent it, I'm going to show another sperm cell fertilizing the egg. So this is now fertilization. And we are now back, after fertilization, we are back to the sporophyte. Now, some diagrams have an extra stage in here, and it is true. We would call it a zygote at first, just like a zygote of an animal, like a sperm fertilizing an egg, and then that zygote can grow and develop into a sporophyte. So there is our basic alternation of generation. Now, in mosses, and sorry, before we move on, so you can real quickly see, if I change colors, right between these two would be our division between haploid and diploid. Anything on this side is going to be diploid. Anything on this side is going to be haploid. So you can see why they call it alternation of generations. Now, if we look back at our mosses, the unusual thing about mosses is the plant that you see, which would normally be, notice what I'm pointing at in the red, the moss plant that you would normally look at on the ground, that's actually the haploid portion. This is the gametophyte portion. It's only the top portion of the moss that is actually the sporophyte. That's why we would call it sporophyte dominant. And the sporophyte, the gametophyte dominant, my bad. So the gametophyte dominant, because that's what we see, the mosses that we would be walking around in our backyard and we look down and there's a moss. Most of the time what we're looking at is the gametophyte. And then down here in this picture, the gametophyte is what we would look at. Oh, there's the leaves, there's the plant. Well, that's gametophyte. And the sporophyte is growing out of the gametophyte. So in the moss, what we would see is actually the gametophyte, one of which is going to bear the egg, and then another gametophyte which produces the sperm cells. And here's another reason why they need to be around water. The sperm cells are going to be needing water because they travel through the flagella. So the water is going to be really important. And once the fertilization occurs, then you'd have the sporophyte growing out and then forming this little sporangium that's going to release the spores. So what's growing inside of here are the spores that will then be released to then grow into more gametophytes. So there's your one foray into the alternation of generations. Now ferns, they also need moist areas, either subtropical or tropical areas. They also have these rhizomes, the roots, which are more like true roots because they are vascular. They have vascular tissue. This is sporophyte dominant. So we start to see a shift in these plants where we're seeing more and more of the sporophytes, where what we see as a typical adult plant is the diploid plant, not the haploid like we saw in mosses. And so in the fern, now it's not going to produce seeds, it's going to produce spores, and the spores develop underneath the leaves, called the sporangium, and they're going to produce spores and release them. And then just as before, the spores, once they're released, they grow into this tiny gametophyte, and that kind of is a really tiny looking plant. On you would never really see it unless you knew what you were looking for, but you can see the gametophyte if you knew what you were looking for on the ground. Now the conifers, the cone-bearing plants, the seeds are not enclosed by the fruits. They're enclosed by a protective cone, a female cone. But then there's also the male cones that are producing the pollen. It's sporophyte dominant, and so are the angiosperms. What we do start seeing is that you can't even see the gametophyte unless you brought out a microscope and examined certain parts of the sporophyte. So we're really seeing the gametophyte being enclosed within these adult trees, the sporophyte. And that gives you an idea of what we're looking at. So for instance, here would be a fern life cycle. Let me just zoom in on that so you can see. Here's our sporophyte. That's 2N. And on the underside of the leaves, there's our sporangia that are producing the spores. So meiosis happened right here to produce the spores, haploid. They are going to grow into the gametophyte, haploid, and the gametophyte is going to produce the sperm and the eggs to then fertilize and become the sporophyte again. And then in the other video I showed, we looked at the angiosperm, the flowering reproduction. So I hope that helped, and let me know if there are any questions in class. Thank you for watching.